one obvious question about the data and what they show us is whether they're correlative or whether they're causative. So, I mean, for instance, you showed the map of the bigger cuts in the Labour authorities as opposed to the Conservative authorities. Presumably, I mean, I don't know, so I'm asking a question from some ignorance here, but one might assume that children, because it was related to children, that children would be in better off families in Conservative areas than they were in Labour areas. So in fact, that's a relationship to poverty rather than the reductions in expenditure. So what for you is the killer diagnosis that says this is causation rather than correlative?
Okay. So that graph was showing cuts in relation to the percentage of children living in poverty in those places. What makes me think all of this is causal? Well, first I'll say that if I had £1 for every time someone had asked me that in the past 10 years, I could join the top 1% of the income distribution.
I know, it's the obvious question.
But it's an important one, and I actually think it's going to be the subject of the next book that we write. Because so often we are challenged as to, not having evidence from randomized control trials of the kind that policymakers can act on, and only having correlational evidence. And I think we need to educate politicians and policymakers about how you do infer causality when you can't do randomized control trials. And my discipline of epidemiology has always been based on observational studies where you can't experiment. And so we've learned and developed criteria for assessing causality, not from a single study or a single experiment, but from a body of evidence. It was first worked out when researchers were trying to understand whether or not smoking caused lung cancer. And you can't experiment and make some people smoke and wait for them to develop lung cancer and others not. And so these criteria for looking at a whole body of evidence were developed then, resisted mightily by the tobacco companies, but nevertheless were developed for that purpose. And we've applied those criteria to this whole body of research on income inequality and health, and it is undoubtedly causal. It's robust, it's growing, it's biologically and psychologically plausible. You start to put together the jigsaw with pieces of evidence to look at the picture as a whole. But some of the most convincing studies are those that look at what happens when inequality changes. So if we look at changes in income inequality over a decade and changes in child well-being, we can see that the countries that improved a bit, became a bit more equal, child well-being improved a bit. And those that became more unequal, child well-being declined. It's data like that. It's studies that say, well, how long does it take when income inequality changes for health to be affected? Mortality rates seem to be affected after 3 to 5 years, and it goes on being important until year 12, and then sort of tails away. So it's those sorts of things, and it's putting...
So in a sense, it's sheer volume. It doesn't matter which way you look at it, you're saying that actually you see this relationship.
It wouldn't help to have like hundreds of studies that all did exactly the same thing. I mean, it would show it was a consistent relationship. But that's
no, I meant volume in the sense that you look at child poverty, or you look at mental health, or wherever you look at it, it appears to demonstrate.
So it's looking for coherence. Yeah.
The second question that I wanted to ask you really was this. You talked about solidarity, and you talked about, there was one slide, I think you talked about people being likely or open to talking to people with mental illness or whatever. And you talked about the ties that bind us. Yeah. And I wondered whether there was any indication within that, whether the us, if you break the us down, what happens to solidarity between like? So if you took upper class, middle class, and working class people, just to be, very sort of schematic about it, when inequality heightens, does solidarity break down in all those groups, or does it break down more in the poorer groups?
I don't think anybody's done that work yet. I think there's certainly studies, the studies are suggestive that it is to do with othering. There is a kind of, the sense of them and us becomes heightened in more unequal societies, so you don't want to help the elderly, you don't want to help migrants, you don't want to talk to people with a mental illness. But I don't think anyone's done that work looking across social classes and whether or not those get broken down. We certainly see sort of more residential segregation of rich and poor with inequality, so fewer opportunities for people to sort of bump into each other. Our school system is highly segregated, so children tend to meet children like themselves and not children representative of society as a whole. So I think you're right, and that must be the case. But I think we do need more research.
And my last question was just, you gave that Norway versus India slide, and that seemed to be a really important understanding for policymakers, because the implication of that is that the provision of sort of stable or clean housing and, loos that flush and clean water and so on and so forth, that fundamentally that only affects a certain aspect, the material. It doesn't affect anything around those feelings of status or failure or whatever. So for policymakers, that clearly has an implication, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not to say that clean, decent housing, warm housing, adequate food, and material well-being are not important. It's just that they are not the be-all and end-all of our well-being. They're an important foundation for our well-being, but they are not sufficient in themselves. We have psychological needs, we have social needs that are not met by material things alone.
And so for policy, that means that people have to concentrate not just on, reforms of the benefit system or whatever. You're suggesting a more wholesale approach or a more whole approach, aren't you?
Yeah.
I've asked my questions because I'm being selfish, but there are about 1 million hands going up. Let's take one down here. And who is there over there in that? Let's call them the poor people and the rich people. Let's see how that works. Is there somebody over there? Because we've got 2 microphones. So if you can indicate somebody in that half of the room, then there's a microphone there. Sir.
Hello, I'm John Connolly. I'm lead counsellor at Westminster Homeless Health Service. And I'm very struck that you're presenting a damning body of evidence there. And it strikes me that the Sure Start campaign was evidence-based, yet it was cut. So I can't help thinking that evidence on its own somehow doesn't provoke change. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were on enabling change to occur beyond the evidence, which we have decades worth of, really.
Well, remember, we're in the age of being fed up with experts, to quote the Minister for the Environment.
Yeah.
It's okay, what's the tool?
Well, your guess is as good as mine, John. In medicine, evidence is taken seriously. And we have mechanisms for making sure that decisions about treatments are based on evidence appropriately. We don't always get it right in there, but, the system is there. But policy making more generally and political decision making is rarely evidence-based. And you can talk to politicians and they'll nod and smile and look like they're listening, but then they'll do exactly what they intended to do anyway. So I suppose, the lesson I take is from looking at social progress in the past. How did we get social progress in the past? Why was the civil rights movement successful to some extent? How did feminism get women's equality onto the political agenda? What about LGBT plus rights? How in the past have people managed to get change? And it's never been because somebody took a bit of evidence to a policymaker and they went, oh, good idea, and handed people their rights. It's always come about because we have demanded it, because we have had grassroots movements where people demanded change, and over time their voice became heard and society shifts. It's come about because people have asked for it. People have demanded change. So that's, I think, where we will see progress coming from. It's from when we manage to mobilize sufficiently and have a loud enough voice to be heard. And when I was in the USA earlier this year, in the middle of the polar vortex, which is really, really interesting, I met a community organizer. And she said, she was asked in a meeting, what gives you hope? Why do you bother, trying to organise the community? And she said, well, they have the power, but we have the people. And I think that's the key.
To some extent, it's unfair, though, isn't it, to just blame politicians and policymakers, because everybody in the room, whilst we laughed at the Louis Vuitton bag, we all know that we've bought things that are around our status as women or men or tall or short or good-looking or not good-looking, and we make those kind of judgments. So to some extent, we are complicit, even though we also see that we have a self-interest in going against our own self-interest. Because your proposition is that if we were less unequal, we would all be better. But as individuals, we may still feel that our self-interest is around being unequal. So that's a conundrum, isn't it? And the thing about those civil rights movements was they posited an overall fairness or an overall sense of progress.
But that's what government is for, isn't it? I mean, I think for those of us who are complicit with this, it's often unconscious complicitness. We're shaped by the society we're in. We can't expect to sort of be free of it. And it is government responsibility, actually, to make political and policy choices that maximise the well-being of all of us. So I feel quite happy blaming them, actually, for not living up to those responsibilities. And the trouble is that it's easier to resist those personal feelings if you have sufficient material resources, or social networks, if you're lucky. But if you lack those things, then those pressures are more intense. I think they are more intense for the vulnerable and excluded in our society. I think they're more intense for our young people. And so it's a matter of social justice, as well as a moral argument. I could make you a good economic argument for greater equality as well.
But I'm just thinking of how those liberation movements managed to generalise particular unfairness. And that was one of the things they managed to do. They managed to make it important. I know that when we started Stonewall, we tried to say it wasn't about us, it was about actually the society you live in.
And of course, what people who raise these issues are always accused of is giving into the politics of envy. And so we need to be able to sort of find a way to go around that.
It's actually the politics of self-interest.
It is the politics of self-interest, because we would all be better off. But it is also a politics of fairness and justice and rights, not envy.
Well, I'll try not to take my Waitrose bag to Lidl then. Down there.
You should take your Waitrose bag if you need to reuse it. Right. I was sort of surprised that you didn't touch on the fact of power dynamics within a social construct. And again, that kind of research has gone back a long time. I think it was in the 60s, was it Stanford University did the thing about prisoners and prison guards? Yeah. And they had to stop the study before people actually got hurt, because people will go into their own little enclaves of, I have the power, and oh my God, I have none. And similarly in the 70s with children, and these were relatively both socioeconomically equal studies. They did a thing in America around brown eyes and blue eyes, basically to look at how inequalities were done within their society. And again, they found that if you give people the chance to polarize, as in a them or an us, you get some very negative, adverse social interactions between the partitioned groups, regardless of their socioeconomic things. And the other thing that hasn't been touched on is that people with vulnerabilities are more likely to be targeted by people with a power complex. For instance, disabled children are 4 times more likely to be abused than able-bodied children. And that's a very uncomfortable statistic, but that's true. But it's also true that homeless people who are vulnerable outside are more vulnerable to attack.
Thank you.
In much the same way. Thank you. That's a really good point. I mean, power dynamics are at the heart of this. Because when we have unequal status, that's what comes into play. And you're right, all of those sort of late last century studies show that if you give kind of artificial power to people or artificially change their status, they do start to act in ways that are unhappily predictable. There are some really, I think, helpful and encouraging psychological studies, though, that also show that humans have an innate sense of fairness and will often act in ways that that reduce the power imbalance between them. And this has been a huge surprise to economists, that sometimes people choose to do things that increase fairness in an experiment rather than give them more power and resources. But power, you're right, it is at the heart of it. Unfortunately, what we don't have good measures of how power operates differently in different societies. So in a way, looking at income inequality is giving us a lens, a mechanism, a measure through which we can look at these issues of power. We have studies that look at bullying in different countries among school children, and you see more bullying in more unequal societies. What we would love to have is a measure of adult bullying, and no such thing exists. I'm sure it would be the same, but we just don't have the data with which we can sort of demonstrate that. So again, this is why it's sort of like building a jigsaw puzzle up with all of the different pieces of evidence.
More? Lady at the back in the red top. There's a guy there with a beard too. So that, if you go first, because you might get the microphone first, and then the woman at the back. Guy with the beard. Yep, it's working, I think.
Yeah, hi. Obviously. Nick Maguire from the University of Southampton. I'm a clinical psychologist. So when you get access to policymakers, what do you think they tell themselves in order to continue to behave to the cost of most people in the country?
That's a really, really good question. I think what a lot of politicians tell themselves is that their own opinion of everything is probably more important than anybody else's. And this is a result of giving them power. I think some of them will use the excuse that this is not experimental evidence, that it is, observational, correlational work, to be able to sort of put it aside and ignore it. I think some of them just think, it's too big a problem. Whatever I do is not going to have any impact. And I think some of them are probably actively, ideologically opposed to seeing this picture. It's very, very hard to shift people's mindset there. I used to think that if we could just demonstrate that the children of the rich were doing worse here than they would in a more unequal society, that would really help. But it hasn't. So.
Do you think they fall back on that kind of, it's human nature, isn't it? We'll always, the poor will always be with us.
The poor will always be with us. There will always be hewers of wood and drawers of water. Some people aren't capable of, earning vast amounts of money, that kind of thing, yeah.
At the back there, thanks.
Hi, I'm Angela Burnett. I'm a doctor at Freedom from Torture. We work with survivors of torture. I wanted to, I was thinking about what you said about learning from sort of social progress in the past, and I was just thinking of the example of where there was a political response, if slow, but this is the women workers at Ford in Dagenham who went on strike for equal pay. And they were on strike and there was no impact. And it wasn't until the men were affected, because basically they had to be laid off because no cars could be produced because there were no seats, which the women had been producing, very skilled work. And at that point, actually, things did change and there was a political response. And I was just thinking of the parallels, the fact that actually this whole community was affected. And that did give a political response and led to the passing of the Equal Pay Act. Oh.
Yeah,
A child cried when I sneezed
Bless
the other
you.
day on the train. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a sort of a good example of like a tipping point, isn't it? And I think, you know, in any political struggle or sort of political movement, grassroots movement, there will be moments that suddenly make something possible that wasn't possible before. If you think about the Me Too movement, you know, decades of silence about a particular phenomenon, and then as soon as you shed a bit of sunlight on one part of it, then it becomes possible for that movement to grow. So I think, you know, as campaigners, as activists, we have to be constantly alert to what those might be and take advantage of them. I mean, lots of us, I think, thought that the global financial crisis would be a tipping point at which we would move towards different kinds of economic policies and structures, but we've wasted that one. So yeah, we have to be on the alert for them, I think. But we also need the structures. You know, we needed trade unions then. We need trade unions now. If you look at union membership over time, it's like the opposite pattern to inequality over time. So, you know, union membership is hugely important and reflective of sort of social and democratic processes in society. But yeah, we have to keep our eyes open, I think. And the other important thing I want to say is that we all have to help each other. So I can do research and I can draw a reasonably comprehensible graph, and I can do a bit of public speaking, although I really, really don't like it. But there's lots of things I can't do and that other people need to do. So we need to be acting collectively. You know, I can campaign and I can do various things. But when we first set up our Equality Trust, a relative of Richard's brother said to me, oh, you should have some music and some poetry and some art, you know, on the Equality Trust's website. And I said, we're not going to have any of that nonsense, you know. We're going to have data and statistics. This is going to be evidence-based. But he was completely right and I was completely wrong, because you reach different people through different ways of communicating. And if we do want to educate broadly about the impact of inequality, then we do need music and theatre and poetry and rap songs and little cartoons going viral and, you know, all of that. And I can't do it. So we need to be networked, and we need to be moving together, and we need to be contributing what we can contribute.
How much does it matter that some people, but a very small number of people, are incredibly rich? So what's the nature of the inequality that really has the worst impact? Do we mind that certain people just earn tons and tons of money, or do we justify some of that? And actually, it's more about the immediate inequalities that we feel up and down. You made quite a play about people's sense of other people being better off than them.
So what the evidence seems to show is that we are sensitive to inequalities across the whole society. You know, it's not just like inequalities among the people we know or the neighbourhoods we live in or our city or whatever. It is the structure of the whole society. So the people at the top do matter. Now, we sometimes make justifications for those runaway salaries, bonuses at the top for particular groups. We're a lot more tolerant of footballers earning vast amounts than we are these days of bankers, although we used to tolerate bankers because we thought they were clever and were looking after our economic interests and knew what was going to happen and all of that kind of thing. But the 1% matter. That top band matters. And so tackling inequality at the top is as important as tackling it at the bottom.
Okay. So just a last question. We've been asked to Oh, I haven't been asked to wrap up. No, oh, good, we've got more time. Let me just ask you about that, and then man behind the man with the stripy shirt there, with the blue check shirt. Let me just ask you, though, so let's say for a minute one of the ways of saying to the very rich, you contribute more. So we increase the amount of tax at the top. Let's take that as a tool. On what would you spend it if you were to make kind of one or two key interventions?
Me?
In the UK, from what your research tells you, what do you think are the key indications that would actually start to have an impact on some of those feelings of mental illness, inadequacy, whatever, that's so damaging?
Oh, you're not going to like my answer because it's a bit of a cop-out. If we taxed the rich properly, if we had progressive, sufficient top marginal tax rates, and we closed loopholes and prevented tax avoidance and tax havens and dealt with all that, we could afford to do everything we wanted to do for our citizens. You know, we wouldn't have to choose, do we spend it on early childhood or the National Health Service?
We get it, that rich people are very good at evading or avoiding tax, let's say. So, okay, so you've got a limited amount of money. What would be the kind of key interventions which would really help the effects of that inequality that you've observed?
Oh, you're going to make me pick one or two, aren't you?
Yes.
All right.
Exactly what I'm trying to do.
Okay, this is why I'll never run the country. First, universal basic income. Second, investment in early childhood education and education at sort of primary as opposed to later on, and get rid of all private education.
Well, that's two.
That's two.
Well,
That'll do.
That's two. Thanks a lot. Over there, and then there's one over there. It's over the back. Hang on. Yes. Trying to get to you and then to you, but thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Kate. I really enjoyed the presentation. Fantastic. I'm Chris Marsh. I work with Doncaster Borough Council and the Clinical Commissioning Group.
Hang on a second. Lovely people. Listen to the nice man at the back with the clean white shirt.
It's like the Speaker of the House there. I love that.
Order!
Thank you. Yeah. So I was really interested in the title of your talk as well as the content with its focus on stress. And I read the book Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey, the Glasgow activist, who talked in really stark terms about the relationship between stress and violence.
Yeah.
And violence in communities, in disadvantaged areas especially, and also violence in families. And we've talked a bit this morning about the impact of trauma in relation to homelessness. And I just wondered what you might have to say about the relationship between stress and violence and how we might think about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are really strong, robust links between inequality and violence. Really strong as there are for health. We know that we get, higher homicide rates, juvenile homicide rates, violent crime in more unequal places. If you go to really unequal societies like Mexico, South Africa, Russia, you can see it visibly in sort of structures on the street, how frightened everybody is of one another. So inequality itself has got these very strong links to violence. But stress, I mean, clearly chronic stress is a mechanism through which inequality is affecting all kinds of different outcomes. But I think you're asking specifically about traumatic experiences, perhaps predominantly in early childhood. And again, I think these are really important things for us to be thinking about. And if we're taking a public health approach to violence as we should, then these are the things we need to be thinking about. But if you look at the lists of things that are considered adverse childhood experiences, like divorce, like neglect or maltreatment, like having been exposed to violence, like having a family member with a mental health problem, or like having a family member in prison, all of those things are influenced by inequality, all of them. So if we tackle inequality, then we're tackling a root cause of a whole range of different sort of consequences, which then in turn go on to cause poor health and violence, etc.
Sorry to raise this at one level, but do you think that the dynamics you describe apply to the relationships between countries and international relations, and whether you think it's a a factor in how countries perceive themselves relative to other countries, and a factor in the current Brexit scenario.
You avoided it until the very, very end.
Yeah.
Certainly, there are studies that show that more equal countries score higher on what's called a global peace index. You know, they're more likely to have friendly relationships with other nations, to pay what they are supposed to pay in terms of foreign aid, to be less likely to go to war, etc., to comply with environmental relationships. So I think that's true. I think for those nations that are ex-colonial powers, I think there is an additional historical legacy there that we find it quite hard to shake off as a society, actually. You know, this idea that somehow we're better than everybody because there used to be lots of pink on the map. I would recommend to you all Danny Dorling's latest book. For those who don't know him, Danny is Professor of Geography at Oxford University. And his most recent book is about the legacy of empire and its impact on Brexit and the voting. So I do think these things are intertwined.
Over there, and then over there. Thank you.
Sam Dorney-Smith, a nurse for Pathway in the London Network. It's been profoundly informative and moving. I just wonder whether you could give us, Kate, something to cheer us up a bit, because I feel a bit depressed now. And the other thing I was going to say was, what can we do for you? Because I'd follow you anywhere now, but what is it that we can do for you to help you get your message out?
Symbols and gowns will be available outside. Locate home.
How very kind of you. You could visit the Equality Trust website. There's a lot of resources there for anybody who's interested, a lot of free resources. You could request a speaker to come talk to any groups you're involved with. You can join in campaigning through the Equality Trust. We have local groups as well. There's a large one in London, but there are, I think, 26 throughout the country. And on that website, you will find sort of what we call manifestos for things that people can do as individuals or within workplaces or that local authorities can do. So there's a lot there, I think, that I hope will help. And just to give you a tiny bit of optimism, I do think that worldwide we are seeing growing recognition of this kind of stuff. We're seeing a growing recognition that it's been stupid to pursue growth and development in terms of just gross domestic product. You know, we are seeing conversations going on around the world about how we create well-being economies, and there's a well-being economy alliance that, again, you can join as an individual or as a group and support. So there's loads we can do, and what gives me the most optimism of all are our young people, actually, because they are progressive and dynamic and wonderful, and they don't seem to be getting less so as they get a bit older. It's great.
A psychiatrist in South East London. I just wonder how you think climate change and environmental degradation plays into this, and actually links to what you just said about the children's climate strike and the Green New Deal, and whether that's a chance to advocate for these sort of positions.
Yeah. Oh, everything's connected, isn't it? So, I mean, who's most harmed by climate change? The poor and the vulnerable, you know, throughout the world. Who's most harmed by air pollution, you know, here in the United Kingdom? The poor and the vulnerable. They're all connected, and of course we can't disentangle the health of human populations from the health of the planet, increasingly. But I think we've lacked frameworks for thinking about that. And I was just writing, it's writing week for me and my research team at the university. We try to have a week, a couple of times a year, where we write something instead of pretending we're writing things. And so I was actually doing some writing on the train and writing just a little paper about suggesting that we need to put aside the model that we've used since 1991 for thinking about the social determinants of health in the UK. Many of you will know it's called the rainbow model. It has individuals at the centre and sort of family and workplace and whatever, but it draws the eye inwards, and I think it is part of the reason why we focus so much on trying to make changes in people's individual lifestyles rather than focusing more on the broader social determinants. And I'm feeling pretty inspired by the economist Kate Raworth's donut economics model. If you've not seen it, Google it. So the donut, it creates a safe and just space for humanity within our planetary boundaries, so we can't exceed our planetary boundaries, but supported by a social floor. And that's all the things we need for good health and well-being: political voice, housing, good health, education, gender equality, peace, all of those things. So I think we do need new models that force us to think in a more holistic way about the interconnections between all of those things. In a way, models shape the way we think about things, perhaps even unconsciously. So I think sometimes you need to get the model right to get your thinking going in the right directions. Please, can you say that name again? Yes, her name is Kate Raworth, Raworth. Her model is the donut model.
Down on the right.
Peter Coxell, Community Housing and Therapy. We've been talking about very big things and big scale, and I was just wondering about our organisations, if there is the degree of inequality and the amount of hierarchy and the distribution of power within organisations, the degree of co-production, and how that affects on staff well-being and indeed on client and patient outcomes.
Yeah, I think it matters hugely. Thank you for raising that. You know, for so many of us, a huge amount of our social contact and our time is spent within the groups within which we work or volunteer, or, you know, or spend our days. And hierarchy within those places does matter, because it's just everything I'm talking about on a sort of small scale. And power differences between people within even small institutions matter. And there's much that can be done to overcome that by, you know, increasing democracy within those institutions, putting in place explicit mechanisms for inclusiveness and diversity and hearing. Again, I see positive shifts there. I spent a day recently with the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Health, who is going to report on the social determinants of mental health in populations very soon. And in the room were academics, third sector workers, people with lived experience, you know, a whole range. And a whole day was spent in very inclusive and respectful listening mode, mostly. We all listened to each other in ways I felt were really positive. And I feel that more is being done around the co-production of such things as that report, or a research project, or a community intervention than used to happen in the past, but there's still a long, long way to go. But, you know, we all have to kind of work towards that within our own institutions and within our own psyches.
I couldn't help but notice, while sort of looking at the graphs on the screen, that Japan was really low down on the inequality sort of end of things, and also really low down on the negative side effects of inequality. What do you think are some of the lessons that we as a nation can learn from Japan?
Japan is hugely interesting. Japan used to be very unequal, and it used to be right down at the bottom of sort of rankings of health. Since the Second World War, it's become very equal, and it has the highest life expectancy in the world. The Americans made them have that greater equality to a great degree. They don't seem to be able to do it for themselves, but they were able to sort of impose it upon Japan.
What, through aid and so on and so forth?
Yeah, and through all kinds of regulatory mechanisms and dismantling things. They had a profound effect on sort of the economy of post-war Japan. I think the important thing that Japan does for us is that it shows that you can get greater equality through mechanisms other than redistribution. Because they don't do a lot of redistribution in Japan, and they don't have a big state. they have smaller income differences before taxes. And so it shows that it doesn't really matter how you get there, as long as you can get more equality. It could be through pre-distribution or redistribution. You'll get more if you do both. But it doesn't matter. And that means that there is a whole range of options open to politicians and policymakers about what they might choose to do to tackle inequality. Some that will appeal more to those on the left, but some that appeal to those on the right as well. So I think that's the useful lesson from Japan.
It's a shame we can't learn more from Japan, because we're both countries are obsessed by tea status, and we used to have empires. Just an observation.
Hello, I'm Jodie and I'm a medical student from Bristol. And I thought I'd just join on from some points you made earlier about the future for change and the young people. And, you know, sitting here, seeing all these stats, I know that it's really inspiring. But I just wondered what methods you thought would be able to be implemented in people sort of my age, in their 20s or younger, that we can start changing and changing how they feel about what's happening. What sort of methods you think would work?
We're starting, through the Equality Trust, we are starting to do a lot of work with young people. We've got some trust funding now to be able to sort of broaden that out and pursue it. I think we need to do things that influence curricula, actually. I think, you know, we need to find ways to get these issues discussed and talked about in schools and with young people. But also, I think we need to find ways to give people spaces and places where they can discuss these issues, where their voices can be heard, and where they can learn to campaign. There's a really great organisation, I'm going to get its name wrong. No, I'm not, hang on. People and Planet, that works with school children and university students around environmental issues and teaches them to campaign. And I think we need a model like that.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate. You as you went through your presentation, I think you underestimated. You talked about the fact that perhaps policymakers and governments and societies and us as individuals don't respond so much actually to the kind of data that you produce. But I think you underestimate the effect that you and Richard have had on that debate, both in terms of driving home that very basic idea that you need to tackle those big issues. And secondly, what that means for policy, which is that actually you have to start with the big causes and then try and coordinate what you do, and equivalent, you know, rather like what you were suggesting, your donut mechanism. So it's been a rare pleasure for us to listen to you. Thank you very much indeed. And I don't think you should underestimate your effect through the books that you've written. So if you'd like to thank Kate very much.